Bonjour à tous. Je suis Boris Proulx, journaliste au Devoir et président de la tribune de la presse nationale. Bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Avant de commencer, je vais parler de quelques règles concernant l'appareil auditif. Pour nos amis interprètes, s'il vous plaît, le tenir loin des micros. Just a little reminder for interpreter friends, if you're in the room, to keep the little earpiece far away from the mic. It can cause hurtful audio feedback for our friends interpreters. Cette conférence de presse, sur le podium, nous avons, on the podium we have the Auditor General of Canada, Karen Hogan, the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, Jerry V. DeMarco. They will talk, of course, about the performance audit reports that have just been tabled in front of the House. On that, Auditor, à vous la parole.
Et merci de vous joindre à nous. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de reconnaître que nous nous sommes réunis sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin-anishinaabe. Je suis accompagnée par Jerry DeMarco, commissaire à l'environnement et au développement durable, qui va présenter 3 des rapports d'audit que mon bureau a remis au Parlement ce matin. Je vais d'abord parler de notre audit des initiatives que le gouvernement du Canada appelle « Nouvelles relations financières avec les Premières Nations ». Le gouvernement s'est engagé à élaborer conjointement des initiatives avec ses partenaires des Premières Nations, notamment un financement fédéral plus prévisible et flexible, afin de favoriser la réconciliation et le transfert progressif des services aux Premières Nations. Overall, we found that Indigenous Services Canada did not effectively implement, monitor, or assess the initiatives it committed to. While the department introduced 10-year grants and payments were aligned with funding agreements, it did not consistently monitor whether grant recipients remained eligible for funding. More than $6.5 billion in grants has been distributed, but the department did not know whether the grants were achieving intended outcomes, including reducing socioeconomic gaps between First Nations and other Canadians. Important initiatives to truly transform the fiscal relationship between First Nations and the federal government remain largely undeveloped. For example, the Indigenous Services Canada did not implement a framework to establish mutual accountability between First Nations and their citizens, and between First Nations and the department. The department also did not meet its key commitment to support the development of First Nations financial management capacity to avoid financial default. Les initiatives liées à la nouvelle relation financière sont un volet important du mandat des services aux Autochtones Canada de transférer progressivement la prestation des services aux Premières Nations. Le ministère doit mieux gérer ses initiatives pour respecter ses engagements, améliorer les résultats socio-économiques et faire progresser la réconciliation. Je passe maintenant à notre audit sur l'accessibilité dans cette organisation fédérale. Dans l'ensemble, nous avons constaté que toutes avaient favorisé un milieu de travail accessible pour les fonctionnaires en situation de handicap, mais que des améliorations importantes restent à apporter. Toutes les organisations auditées avaient réalisé des progrès en matière de représentation des personnes en situation de handicap au sein de leurs effectifs. Nous avons aussi constaté que les taux de promotion étaient comparables entre les différents groupes d'employés dans les 7 organisations. Aussi, elles avaient toutes mis en place des pratiques favorisant l'accessibilité. Par exemple, elles avaient nommé un membre de leur haute direction comme champion ou championne de l'accessibilité et elles avaient créé des réseaux pour les personnes en situation de handicap. While I am encouraged by the progress to date in representation and the commitment to accessibility, there is still room for improvement in how accommodations are delivered and employees with disabilities are engaged. For example, we found that employee networks were not consistently consulted on the implementation of decisions that affected them. In addition, while all organizations had measures in place to address workplace barriers, processes to deliver accommodations need to be improved. The time required to respond to employees' accommodation requests ranged from an average of 24 to 310 days. Inconsistent data collection limited the ability of organizations to identify recurring issues and systemic barriers. Federal organizations have a duty to ensure that employees can participate fully and equally in the workplace. Building on the progress made to date requires an ongoing focus on accessibility and efficient processes. I will now turn it over to the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development to summarize the remaining three reports.
Merci. Le rapport que je présente aujourd'hui porte sur les efforts du gouvernement fédéral pour répondre aux défis mondiaux posés par le changement climatique et la grippe aviaire. Pour mieux protéger les Canadiens et les Canadiennes, aujourd'hui et à l'avenir, il faut des mesures plus fermes pour s'adapter à un monde qui change très vite. Notre premier audit portait sur la cartographie des zones inondables, un enjeu de plus en plus important dans un contexte de changement climatique au Canada. Nous ne pouvons plus nous fier uniquement aux données actuelles pour nous préparer aux inondations. Nous devons aussi planifier en fonction des scénarios climatiques futurs, notamment l'évolution des tendances de précipitation. Cela est d'autant plus pertinent parce que plusieurs régions du Canada ont connu ou connaissent d'importantes inondations ce printemps. La carte des zones inondables sert à informer les citoyens et citoyennes, les promoteurs d'immobilier et les responsables de la planification d'infrastructures des risques d'inondation dans un secteur donné. We found that Natural Resources Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Public Safety Canada were slow to produce and share the flood maps needed to protect communities and support climate change adaptation. Natural Resources Canada did not ensure that mapping efforts prioritized higher risk areas. Many maps remain incomplete, and much of the existing mapping information is not practical or usable. The department is also not on track to make all maps currently in production publicly available by the target year of 2028. We also found that Public Safety Canada planned flood risk awareness portal did not integrate climate change considerations or allow information to be easily updated as conditions change. This means that information in the portal will not reflect changes to flood risks over time. Climate change projections and easily available flood maps are needed to reliably inform long-term planning decisions, such as where to build homes or develop infrastructure. Canadians face escalating risks and higher disaster recovery costs in the absence of up-to-date information. Notre prochain audit a révélé des lacunes importantes dans la surveillance exercée par le Secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor du Canada à l'égard de la stratégie pour un gouvernement vert, qui vise à renforcer la résilience climatique des services et des actifs fédéraux, qui ont une valeur estimée à environ 100 milliards de dollars. Le cadre de suivi des progrès était insuffisant et, malgré des engagements répétés, le secrétariat n'a pas produit de rapport public sur la résilience climatique pendant les 8 premières années qui ont suivi le lancement de la stratégie en 2017. Ces lacunes ont nui à la prise de décision et à la reddition de comptes. Au niveau institutionnel, l'audit a examiné comment la Défense nationale, Services publics et approvisionnement Canada et Pêche et Océan Canada évaluaient les risques climatiques. L'audit a aussi examiné les mesures prises pour renforcer la résilience climatique des biens, services et activités dont ils sont responsables. À eux seuls, ces 3 ministères gèrent plus de 2/3 des biens matériels du gouvernement fédéral, comme les bâtiments et les ponts. Nous avons constaté qu'ils avaient fait peu de progrès, pour transposer les évaluations des risques en mesures concrètes. This lack of progress has clear environmental and financial consequences for Canadians. As Canada warms at twice the global average, accelerating efforts to protect federal assets and services will sustain communities and save taxpayers' money over time. For example, some small harbors, which directly support more than 45,000 jobs, are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and require immediate repairs and reinforcement. Our final audit assessed the federal response to avian influenza. An outbreak of this disease began in Canada in 2021, and there were concerns the virus could mutate and become more easily transmissible. While Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and Public Health Agency of Canada took action to prevent and manage outbreaks of avian influenza, we found that they need to improve on planning, documentation, and the management of human vaccines to better prepare for future threats to public health and vulnerable wildlife. Par exemple, l'Agence canadienne d'inspection des aliments avait exécuté avec succès des procédures d'élimination du virus dans les 47 établissements compris dans notre échantillon d'audit. Cependant, nous avons relevé des lacunes dans la documentation de l'agence à cet égard. Environnement et Changement climatique Canada avait réaffecté des fonds pour renforcer sa surveillance des oiseaux migrateurs en réponse à l'éclosion de 2021, mais sans financement consacré, il pourrait être difficile de maintenir ces efforts à long terme. De plus, le ministère n'a pas axé sa surveillance sur les répercussions du virus sur les espèces qui sont menacées ou qui pourraient le devenir. Finally, with respect to preparedness, we found that the Public Health Agency of Canada secured vaccines for people at higher risk of exposure, such as farmers and veterinarians, but purchasing decisions were not supported by sufficient analysis. This led to an oversupply, and more than 95% of the purchased vaccine doses expired before they could be used. I will now turn it back over to the Auditor General. Thank you. Merci.
Thanks, Jerry. Across these audits, a consistent pattern emerges. Programs are in place, funding is being delivered, and risks are known. But weaknesses in implementation and monitoring affect the achievement of results. This is not a new pattern. I raised similar concerns at the midpoint of my mandate last year about long-standing issues in how federal programs are designed, delivered, and measured, including in areas affecting First Nations. Notre audit des nouvelles initiatives financières montre que quand un ministère ne respecte pas ses engagements visant à régler des problèmes de longue date, il ne parvient pas à livrer des résultats cruciaux, comme faire progresser la réconciliation. Notre audit de la grippe aviaire fait ressortir des problèmes semblables, dans un contexte différent. Je suis préoccupée parce que malgré l'expérience d'avoir géré des enjeux de santé publique passés, notamment la pandémie de COVID-19, les lacunes touchant la planification, les données et la prise de décision persistent et continuent de nuire à la préparation face aux menaces futures. Merci, thank you. We're now ready to take your questions.
Merci. Nous allons maintenant procéder à la période de questions. Please limit yourself to one question per one follow-up per journalist. I'll start in the room and then I'll go online. You can use the raise hand function at this time if you're online for later. First question, Chris Rands, CBC.
Hi, Auditor General. Great to see you. Got to ask you in very general layman's terms about the Indigenous financial delivery. Given that many First Nations are small, their business offices could be one person, a handful of people, and given that the corresponding bureaucracy that they're dealing with is relatively large, demands a fair amount of documentation back and forth frequently, what do you want to see moving forward with this?
I don't think it's really up to me to say what we should see forward. What I want to see is better collaboration and co-creation with the department and First Nations communities. And last year at my mid-mandate, I talked about the government needing to really transform the way it interacts with First Nations communities, and I was hopeful that the new fiscal initiatives would be different. And I think that it fell short in meeting its mark. It took existing funding and repackaged it into a long-term, predictable, and stable set of funding. But the really transformative things that should have happened just are underdeveloped right now. So really creating the better capacity for some smaller communities to be able to meet some of the requirements, and creating a mutual accountability framework that would allow there to be nation-to-nation accountability, but also accountability between First Nations and their citizens. And those are things that they outlined. The First Nations partners outlined that that's what they wanted this to look like, and the federal government just hasn't delivered on it.
I have to react to what you're talking about accountability and nation to nation and so on. What does that actually mean to your neighbor, to me, to the person on the street? I understand auditors have a very focused and very precise way of doing things, but can you just sort of expand on that? What does that actually mean, please?
I think I could use an example that we're all living. We have nation-to-nation accountability between the federal government and provinces and territories. There are transfers around health that go to provinces and territories, and there is an accountability back at a certain level. But provinces and territories are allowed to decide what to do with that funding. And it's that kind of mutual nation-to-nation relationship that I think would change part of how the federal government right now interacts with First Nations organizations and governments.
Merci. We'll go to David, CBC.
Hi. My question is about the flood hazard mapping audit. One thing that stood out to a lot of us reporters was that climate change was not taken into account when it comes to some of the planning. Can you just speak a bit more to that? Are we talking about the 200 or so hazard maps did not consider climate change, or are we just talking about the federal portal? Is there a difference there that we should be paying attention to?
Yes, the 200 or so maps that are going to be high-resolution regulatory level maps, they can factor in climate change according to the capabilities that the government organizations involved have, including Environment and Climate Change Canada's capabilities regarding climate change scenarios. But the accessible public portal from Public Safety Canada, which is one of the areas of focus of our audit, does not provide Canadians with scenarios that factor in future climate change, changes in precipitation, changes in water levels, and so on. So it's of limited utility for those who are considering buying a house or for developers who may want to build in an area. The portal needs to be useful to Canadians, needs to be able to factor in climate change scenarios, subject to whatever uncertainty is present, and needs to be able to be updated with new information. Right now, the way it's designed, it doesn't have those capabilities.
And maybe you could help me understand this. Are the maps different from the portal? Like, would they, presumably when they get some of these 200 maps finished, would they just put them online? Would they go into the portal, or is that separate? What's the difference between the two? Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, the portal is supposed to be a national level tool where you could just type in your address. In fact, they launched a prototype of it a couple of days ago, but the part where you can put in your address is still grayed out, is coming soon. So it's supposed to be a national level database where you could put in any address and get information. The higher resolution technical maps, the regulatory level ones that Natural Resources Canada is helping to fund, those are for a different purpose. Those are for very specific use by municipalities and provinces in making land use planning decisions and so on. Those are not intended to be on the portal. Those are for more specific local areas.
Catherine, Canadian Press.
Hi, thanks so much for taking our questions. Kind of continuing on with the flood mapping and the portal specifically, I know it's mentioned in the report that it's important that the maps be user-friendly and interactive to ensure people can prepare. And I know you just touched on it a little bit, but wondering if you can maybe expand on, what else, what exactly is lacking right now and what needs to be done to make them more user-friendly.
So historically, one could plan for flood events by looking in the past at the 100-year flood line and so on, and make decisions based on that. But Canada's climate is unfortunately changing rapidly at twice, in terms of temperature, at twice the global rate. So simply extrapolating from the past is no longer good enough. We need to look to the future and adapt accordingly. So having a public portal where people considering buying a house would be able to look up their address or the prospective address for where they'd like to move to, that would be very helpful in terms of making what may be the most important financial decision of their lives. But if it doesn't have the capability of factoring in climate change scenarios, then it's of limited utility. It's simply extrapolating from the past. So that's why we've recommended in our report that they improve the portal so that it is both able to incorporate climate change scenarios and easily updatable with new information.
Thank you. And then on another topic, I'm wondering if you can please share a little bit about why there was no mention of the BC ostrich farm in your report on avian flu.
Yes, so our sample and our audit period included a number of sites whose files were opened and closed during the audit period. That file was still quite active by the time that our audit period was over, so it was not possible to include that one during this audit.
Frédéric, Radio-Canada.
Oui, bonjour. Ma question est pour vous, Monsieur DeMarco. Je voulais vous entendre sur les risques au niveau des infrastructures en lien avec les changements climatiques. Pour que monsieur, madame, tout le monde comprenne un peu ce que vous voulez dire, parce que dans votre rapport, c'est très généralisé. Vous avez très peu d'exemples concrets là, sur le concret. J'ai bien aimé l'exemple pour les ports. Je trouvais que ça c'était quand même du concret. Mais les risques importants, là, selon vous, est-ce que ça veut dire, vous avez dit les ponts tantôt, est-ce que ça veut dire qu'il y a des ponts qui sont à risque présentement au Canada? Est-ce que ça veut dire que le gouvernement, dans certains cas, n'a pas l'information sur certaines infrastructures qui pourraient être à risque en parlant de ponts, justement?
Oui, avec les actifs fédéraux, soit le port, les quais, les routes ou les ponts, et très peu de ces actifs fédéraux ont un plan de résilience pour mieux protéger contre le changement climatique. Alors, comme nous avons dans notre pièce, dans notre rapport, seulement 3% de ces actifs très essentiels ont des plans de résilience. Et aussi, on a besoin de mettre en œuvre ces plans pour être résilient. Alors, oui, il y a des actifs qui ne sont pas analysés pour le risque. Il y a d'autres qui ont un risque et ils n'ont pas un plan pour les protéger, oui.
Vous avez parlé des zones inondables tout à l'heure. La région ici, à Gatineau, est présentement inondée dans certains secteurs. La province se penche déjà sur les zones inondables avec les municipalités. Pourquoi est-ce que c'est important pour le fédéral de continuer à mettre à jour ces outils? Comment est-ce que ça peut venir aider concrètement les gens qui vivent les changements climatiques encore actuellement et dans les prochaines années pour la planification?
Oui, alors le focus de cet audit est surtout sur les nouveaux cartes et planifiées pour le futur pour éviter qu'est-ce qu'on voit aujourd'hui avec le changement climatique et les inondations. Et alors, on n'a pas analysé les efforts pour les zones qui sont déjà connues comme inondables. C'est plutôt d'être proactif pour éviter que le coût pour les Canadiens et les Canadiennes augmente parce qu'on décide de construire une nouvelle infrastructure ou de nouvelles maisons dans une région avant de savoir ça va être inondable au futur. Alors, c'est plutôt pour prévenir et de planifier pour le futur au lieu de seulement réagir aux désastres quand ils sont présents.
We'll go to Abigail, CTV, sorry.
Abigail Beeman, CTV News. Thanks for taking my question. If I may ask on another topic, today the federal government announced a $1 billion loan program for steel and aluminum businesses hit by U.S. tariffs, and the emergency funding is reminiscent of some pandemic loan programs with emergency money that your previous reports had said lacked value for money. I'm just wondering if you're concerned that the government could repeat some of these mistakes about managing this program.
So unfortunately, I haven't heard even about the announcement between Parliament Hill and here today. I really can't comment on it. What I would tell you is that when it comes to loan programming, I would like to see that there is a way to measure that the intended outcomes are happening. And we saw that in the new fiscal report here, in that there was repackaging of funding to make it long-term and predictable and flexible, but no metric to decide 7 years later, was it meeting its objective of reducing socioeconomic impact? So I would expect that any loan program would have a goal and an objective, and that the government would set itself out at the beginning, at the start, as they design this, to have a way to measure value for money and outcomes for Canadians.
That's a super helpful answer. Just as a follow, anything else in terms of advice to make sure that the government gets value for a dollar? And I hear you on the metric point, but anything else as they look to what seems to be a pretty large program here?
It's hard for me to opine on that, I'll be really honest, without knowing the ins and outs of what that program might look like. But at a high level, it's not just waiting for a decade down the line. It's having measurable points along the way, in addition to having an ultimate goal, would be my really quick high-level answer for you.
We have time for taking questions online. If you're attending online, you can use the raise hand function at this moment. I don't see any hands, though. On peut continuer dans la salle. I don't know if you have some more questions, Catherine.
I have a question about your report on accessibility in the public service. I'm just wondering, there's obviously a lot of moving parts in the public service right now, with lots of cuts and also with executives back in the office full-time today, and then the rest of many more public servants, in July going back to the office for 4 days a week. I'm wondering if you have any concerns about, either representation, how that will be tracked moving forward with the cuts, and also with how accommodation requests will be handled with people going back to the office on a more regular basis.
There's two halves to that question. I guess if I look first off at accommodation requests, ultimately our workplaces should be accessible, but by design. And until that happens, that's where the duty to accommodate process kicks in. Waiting, as we saw in the report, on average 300 days is too long to just be able to do your work. So I would expect that departments would try to put some rigor to it. We saw when organizations were tracking the timeliness, they had better outcomes. But right now, it's up to everyone to decide how to track and what to do. So that would, I think, be a concern. When it comes to representation, I would tell you there's good progress made here. But I would qualify it as, I guess, somewhat fragile as the government goes through changes. And that means that care and attention needs to be put to how workforce adjustments will happen, or how early retirements will be processed. We had an opportunity, however, to look at the Canada Revenue Agency, since they had been sort of the first wave of some of those cuts, and we saw that it didn't have a negative impact, but that means care and attention needs to continue. And it's not just these 7 organizations. I would tell you every deputy head should think about this and look at our recommendations, because we're all part of the federal family and have a role to play in an accessible public service.
David, you had another question?
Yes. Going back to flood hazard mapping, can you give me a sense on why the federal government seems to be falling short, seems to be falling behind? Did they give you any credible reason for that, and why this portal is taking so much time?
So you can question the departments as to what their reasoning behind the slow rate of progress is, but what I would say that in terms of protecting Canadians, in terms of their property, their lives, and costs to Canadians, accelerating efforts is in everybody's interests. A dollar invested today in flood mapping or in climate resilient infrastructure will save multiple dollars in the future. Kicking the can down the road, on the other hand, is not a good approach for protecting the interests of Canadians. So regardless of the reasons why it's taken so long to get where they are on both flood mapping and on climate resilience, let's see an acceleration in the efforts moving forward and a focus on results. And that's a theme, as you know, in several of my reports over the years, shifting from good intentions and plans to concrete, measurable, and timely results. That's really what's needed.
Frédéric?
Monsieur DeMarco, je veux vous entendre encore sur les ponts. Je reviens là-dessus. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous dire simplement, est-ce que selon votre rapport, selon vos enquêtes, est-ce qu'il y a des infrastructures qui sont à risque physiquement pour leur intégrité? Est-ce qu'il y a des ponts qui pourraient s'effondrer parce qu'ils ne sont pas bien analysés?
Alors, notre audit a regardé le programme en total. Il y a plus de 2000 actifs fédéraux qui ont été le sujet d'analyse par notre équipe d'audit. Je ne peux pas vous identifier des sites spécifiques. Ça serait une très grande audit de regarder chaque pont et chaque route et chaque phare et chaque quai. Alors, globalement, on pouvait dire qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup de résultats jusqu'à maintenant. Est-ce que je peux dire, ça veut dire que un pont à Montréal va être à risque demain? Non, je ne peux pas vous dire ça. Mais ça, c'est le rôle de le ministère. Ils ont besoin de faire ces analyses et ensuite faire des plans de résilience et ensuite les mettre en œuvre.
Merci. Thank you. That concludes our press conference. Merci beaucoup à tous. Merci.
Merci.
Preparing for this, and these are migratory birds with the link to the avian flu report. So, good catch.